I'm Robert Schoch, and I'm a Boston University faculty member full-time. I received a PhD in geology and geophysics in 1983 from Yale University. I was happily working on fossil mammals and the evolution of those organisms and the environments that they lived in. And that was really my field, and I was interested in things like the end of the last ice age. And then in the late 1980s, I met a man named John Anthony West. And John Anthony West had this crazy theory that he had actually gotten from another researcher named R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, that the Sphinx might be older than the traditional date of 2500 BCE. So I was introduced through a colleague at Boston University to John Anthony West. We talked about it. I thought that there was little chance that there could be anything to this theory because it was based on the concept that maybe the Sphinx was weathered and eroded by water rather than wind and sand, because the Sphinx sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert, which has been a desert for the last 5,000 or so years. So I humored John Anthony West. I listened to a presentation he gave at Boston University. We talked at length. We corresponded. Then he invited me to go to Egypt with him in 1990 to see the Sphinx for myself. I thought I would simply go show him geologically why he was wrong, that the Sphinx has the traditional date of 2500 BC, end of story. I'll have visited Egypt once, which would be enough for a lifetime. I did not expect what I got when I went to Egypt. Within minutes, I realized that there was something amiss with the standard chronology, that here was a Sphinx definitely weathered and eroded by precipitation, by tremendous rainfalls, not Nile flooding, that this meant the Sphinx had to go back to an earlier climatic regime well before the Sahara Desert was in place, not hyper-arid weathering that we were seeing on the Sphinx, but from rainfall, and tremendous rainfall. And this changed everything. And so that led to years of study, analysis, seismic work, and I am 100% convinced at this point that the origins of the Sphinx go back to approximately the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 or so BCE. And it's very important that people understand I'm not talking about the Sphinx as it is today. The head on the body of the Sphinx is too small for the body that we see now. It's the head of a human. I first speculated that the head was originally a lion, and what happened was the lion's head became deeply eroded, deeply weathered, and they recarved it in dynastic times thousands of years later. So when I first went to see the Sphinx, I was aware very quickly that the head was out of proportion to the body. The head is too small for the body. I initially speculated that the head of the current Sphinx was originally a lion, and that the lion's head had become weathered and eroded. They repaired the body of the Sphinx by putting in small limestone blocks. But the head, what I speculated with the head, is that instead of trying to repair it with blocks, they simply recarved it. So when it was recarved, it became too small proportionally to the body, and to this day, people can notice that when it's pointed out to them. So I thought it was a lion originally with a much larger head. We now have evidence, and this is something I've worked on with my colleague Manu Saifzadeh, Dr. Saifzadeh, that no, it was not a lion in the sense of a male lion, but a lioness. It was a female lion representing the goddess Mehit or Mehit, who guarded an archive. And the text says that the Sphinx, or the proto-Sphinx I'll call it, guarded an archive. Something else that we found seismically back in the early 1990s, and I was working with Dr. Thomas DeBecke on this, a geophysicist. I'm a geologist and geophysicist, and we found a chamber under the Sphinx, under the left paw of the Sphinx, which I am now convinced is in fact an archive or some kind of place where records were stored, that the proto-Sphinx, I'll use that term, in the form of a lioness, guarded or stood over, literally sits over to this day. So a lot has come together over the decades, piecing all these parts, all this evidence together. I'm now convinced the earliest portions of the Sphinx, which is what I call the core body, go back at least to about 10,000 BC, just before the end of the last ice age. It was a lioness, the goddess Mehit, or Mehit, as she was referred to, at least in early dynastic times. And under that statue, under the lioness, is a chamber that probably is an archive holding records from a very early period of time. Under the Sphinx, which was originally a lioness, but the statue that we now see is the Sphinx with a human head, there is a chamber under the left paw. We found that. The textual evidence indicates that that was an archive, or a place where records were kept. And I talk about this at length in my book, Forgotten Civilization, and I point this out. And something else I point out in my book, Forgotten Civilization, is that Edgar Cayce, the American psychic who passed away before I was even born, actually predicted that there would be a, quote, hall of records near or under the Sphinx. And I want to say very clearly, I'm an academic. I did not go there looking for the hall of records. I didn't even know that Edgar Cayce had talked about a hall of records near the Sphinx when we found that chamber. We were not looking for chambers. What I was looking for with the seismic data was to compare subsurface mineralogical changes once the core body of the Sphinx, what we now call the Sphinx, once the core body was freed from the bedrock, the rock starts to change. It's a type of weathering, and you have mineralogical changes, and I wanted to see how deep those go, because that's a way for me to calibrate how long ago the core body of the Sphinx was freed up. It was only a secondary thing that we found the chamber under the paws. I was never looking for it, and I have to admit, I was a bit embarrassed initially when I was told, oh, Edgar Cayce, the psychic, had predicted that, because that did not help me with my academic colleagues that somehow I was confirming a psychic's notion. So it's a little embarrassing, but I have to be honest. He did predict it. We did find it. It is there. I'm 100% convinced, and I would still, at this point, like to pursue it further. I think it's important that we get to the, quote, bottom of it and explore it further.
Well, have the Egyptian authorities gone in? Zahi, have they gone in there? Manu says there's a manuscript that's been come from that part of the chamber. I mean, what has been the investigations into that Hall of Records, if you want to call it that?
At this point, I cannot confirm that anything has been investigated when it comes to the Hall of Records, or if we want to call it the Hall of Records. Let's just call it the chamber under the Sphinx. There has been a lot of denials on the part of various archaeologists and Egyptologists that it doesn't exist, or that the evidence isn't strong enough to support it. I feel very confident with the seismic work that we did, and what I would like to propose, if I would be allowed to do it, is not to be invasive, certainly not initially. I would like to do further non-invasive research to pinpoint precisely and accurately where it is, and then we could take the next step if it seemed appropriate. And I use as an example something that's been going on just recently with the Scan Pyramids project, where again, non-invasive techniques, and I am a geophysicist in part, so this is the type of studies I'm associated with and feel comfortable with, do non-invasive, totally non-invasive, non-destructive techniques to pinpoint, map it accurately, and confirm, double confirm that it is there, and then we can take it from there.
Right. I know you're a geologist, but you know, John Anthony West would say no one wanted to mention the A word, Atlantis. So so you don't have to, but who do you think this older civilization could have been? I mean, the technology and development you need to carve something out of bedrock in the shape of a line, that's thousands of years of civilization to come to that, and the mythologies and all that go along with the lioness. So who were, in your guess, this ancient civilization that created the lioness, Sphinx, and the whole array?
I really don't know who these people were, because I think what we do in modern times is people like to put names on groups of people, ancient people. We give them names, and many times those names are simply named after the site where they were first found. It's not the name that they used for themselves. So these were Egyptians, but they were Egyptians who were living in what we now call Egypt. I doubt that they called themselves Egyptians. We don't know who they were or what they called themselves. There's, of course, the concept of Atlantis, and some people say they were survivors from Atlantis, but that comes from Plato. That comes from the Greeks, who Plato got from Solon, who was a Greek who visited Egypt around maybe 600 or so BCE, and was told reputedly this story about Atlantis going back to 9600 BCE or so, based on, if you take the Plato's account of it and put it into our own chronology. And, you know, so people use the term Atlanteans, but who knows who they really were? I think that we have to sort of divorce ourselves from wanting to put easy labels on things. It's too easy to put a label on something, and then that carries meaning and weight, which is not really appropriate, not really based on the evidence. So I think sometimes we just have to hold back and say that, yes, there were sophisticated people in this part of the world who were carving something like, I'll call it the proto-Sphinx, building structures that are associated with it, had an archive under the paw. And as far as I'm concerned, they were Egyptians in the sense that they lived in what we now call modern Egypt. And I want to make it very clear to me that I don't necessarily think that they came from somewhere else. It may have been totally indigenous. We also now know that, for instance, at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, they were people who were working and living and building structures. The Göbekli Tepe structure and other structures now that are being found that are associated with Göbekli Tepe. We don't know what they called themselves. We can refer to them as the Göbekli Tepe people, but again, that's a modern name for them. I've actually coined the term Orion or Orianic, referring to this earlier cycle of civilization, coming from the Indo-European, the Proto-Indo-European root of origins or original or proto. But again, this is a modern term just to have a handle on it, to call them something. We talk about the Renaissance, for instance, in Western Europe. Back then, they weren't saying, oh, we're the Renaissance. These are later terms. So we have to keep our open mind and look for more evidence.
Well, but you can talk about a concept, John West, or a fact that the farther back you go in Egyptian investigations, the more complex those structures were, and then they reached a point of de-evolution. Talk about that, like this rise and then fall and then re-rising of a civilization.
Yeah, something that I'm finding in my research, and this is very different than what I was taught as an undergraduate and graduate student, is that we don't necessarily have a one-way linear progression from simpler to more complex to more complex to more complex. What I'm seeing now is something that the ancient traditions always talked about, which is that there are what I call cycles of civilization. There were forerunner civilizations. So the ancient Egyptians, 4,500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, in early dynastic times, they talked about an earlier civilization, a very sophisticated civilization that was thousands of years earlier before them. If we put it into modern chronologies, they refer to the period as Zep Tepe. the earlier time, the first time, sort of the creation of civilization, and I am convinced that something like the proto-Sphinx, the origins of the Sphinx, go back to that period. So if we want to use a dynastic term for it, we might refer to it as Zeptepe or the Zeptepe people, which the ancient Egyptians 5,000, 4,500 or so years ago acknowledged and talked about, and so many people in modern times have said, well, that's just mythology. They were just trying to give themselves credibility, saying that they had these remote ancestors. No, we're now finding evidence for those remote ancestors. Furthermore, we're finding, just as many of the traditions and legends say, that earlier cycle of civilization, those advanced people suffered. There were natural catastrophes, and they were decimated. And this comes from what was happening at the end of the last ice age. In my work in geology and applying geology to archaeological sites and looking at the end of the last ice age, I am 100% convinced now that the best evidence, the evidence is pointing to the sun, that there are major solar outbursts around 9,700 BCE. This caused the climatic changes that we see on Earth. It caused the earthquake activity, the volcanic activity, essentially the cataclysm on Earth that we as geologists know about. And very, very importantly, it put incredible amount of moistures into the atmosphere, because you had this incredible warming period. You literally had what's known as plasma discharges from the sun, electrically charged particles moving at incredibly high speeds, hitting Earth. In some cases would have looked like huge thunderbolts hitting the Earth, melting glaciers, evaporating water, changing the climatic patterns, making it much warmer, but putting all this moisture into the atmosphere, which came down as precipitation. I think this was the initial weathering on the Sphinx, the water weathering and erosion. We have stories of floods around the world. That's not just rising sea levels, which you had at the end of the last ice age, but these huge flash floods from all this precipitation. Again, this is physical evidence, geology, and we have the ancient cultures, the archaeological evidence. At Göbekli Tepe in particular, we see signs of catastrophe. We see pillars that were knocked over and then re-erected hastily, crude walls built at that time, close to 12,000 years ago, 9,700 BCE, and then the whole site being intentionally buried over once again. And when you look at some of the legends, for instance, one of the best known legends in the Western world is Atlantis. And Plato puts the chronology of Atlantis, that Atlantis was destroyed, converting it to our modern calendar in about 9600 BCE. The dating for these catastrophes based on ice core data, particularly from Greenland and a number of other lines of evidence, is about 9700 BCE. I will give Plato that century. I think it's incredibly accurate. He was just talking in round numbers. 9,000 years before Solon, who was approximately 600 BCE. So when we talk about Atlantis, and for a long time as an academic, I did not want to talk about Atlantis because it carries all kinds of negative connotations in academia. If you're talking about Atlantis as anything other than just a philosophical metaphor, should we say. I think the point of Atlantis, at least what I get from the classical Platonic account, the Plato's account of Atlantis, is that forget about all the details of where the city is and where it was located, et cetera, et cetera. The important point from my perspective is the dating of it, that there was an advanced, sophisticated society, true civilization at a much earlier period of time, and it was decimated, as Plato's concept of Atlantis says, as his recounting of Atlantis says, it was decimated virtually overnight in the 10th millennium BCE by our modern standards. at the end of the last ice age. Put the real date on it, 9700 BCE, and we have the physical evidence that occurred, those changes occurred virtually overnight, within at least a matter of weeks, probably days, just like we have the Atlantis account that it happened virtually immediately. Looking at the timeline as I'm developing it based on the evidence, and of course this is subject to change as we bring in more evidence, we know that there was a cycle of civilization. We have evidence for a cycle of advanced society and civilization that was decimated at the end of the last ice age. So the date for that is 9700 BCE. We do not know how far back that civilization goes. I don't want to say that we know the origin of it. The best evidence for it right now, because it's the best preserved evidence, is Göbekli Tepe and the site of Göbekli Tepe and associate sites. And the preliminary evidence is it was decimated in 9700 BCE by the natural catastrophes of the time, and that some of these sites go back at least a couple of thousand years earlier. Based on preliminary evidence we have now, we don't know how much earlier. But certainly it did not happen overnight. It didn't just all of a sudden magically appear. There must have been, in my assessment, time leading up to it. So that's open-ended. So the cycle of civilization ends with the catastrophes at 9700 BCE. There are huge mass extinctions, among other things, at that time from the solar outburst, which would have destroyed the ozone layer, compromised the magnetosphere, allowed essentially what people call solar rays and cosmic rays and protons traveling at very high speed to enter the atmosphere. You would have had a lot of radiation on the surface of the Earth. Large mammal die-offs occur at that time. Human populations were decimated around the world, wildfires, etc. How did some people survive? By going underground. So you have this whole complex of underground caves and other animals surviving underground. And we go into what Katie, my wife, and I refer to as SIDA, S-I-D-A, which stands for the Solar-Induced Dark Age. So essentially humanity goes into a dark age that was caused by the sun and the outbursts of the sun, sort of ironic. But we go into a dark age for about 6,000 years, from 9700 BCE to about the middle of the 4th millennium BC. So think in terms of 6,000 years, that would be up to about 3700 BCE, so a 6,000 year period. And then civilization at that point re-emerges. The sun has stabilized, it's much more stable, much less erratic, and civilization starts to re-emerge. The analogy I use, because people often can relate to it, is in Western Europe. You had the fall of the Roman Empire. You go into a dark age in the medieval period, and then centuries and centuries later, they start to rediscover Roman artifacts, and you start to have a blossoming of civilization again, and we go into the Renaissance. The same thing is happening here in analogy, but on a larger scale. Cycle of civilization, decimated, dark age, solar-induced dark age, SIDA, and then a reemergence of civilization about 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, and we are now in that new cycle of civilization, which I date from the time of the Sumerians and the Egyptians up to our present electronic age. So when you look at the pyramids of Giza, for instance, they become somewhat problematic, because I'm convinced that things were happening on the Giza Plateau during that earlier cycle of civilization. Certainly you had the Proto-Sphinx, and there are certain structures associated with the Proto-Sphinx that goes back to the end of the last ice age. For instance, what's now known as the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple, and some other structures. As far as the current pyramids, I think, based on the evidence, and I'm still working on this, so this is preliminary, that the sites of the 3 major pyramids were acknowledged at a much earlier period. In fact, there's evidence on the Giza Plateau that this is one place where solar outbursts, plasma strikes literally hit, and it seems to have hit where the proto-Sphinx was, or in that area, and it was hit other places on the plateau. You can see vitrification, I'm convinced, from this event, and the sun was associated with God or the eternal, and this is literally, you could say metaphorically, where God's fingers touch the earth. So it became a sacred site. So this ties in with why are the pyramids there, what was built initially. The final pyramids that we see today certainly were partly dynastic, but are they being built over other structures? Are they reformulations? Did the dynastic Egyptians appropriate unto themselves older structures that they refurbished, they repaired, they rebuilt? This is something that I continue to research. So as an example, you have the second pyramid, which has a ring of granite around the base. This is something that the ancient dynastic Egyptians did to show that they were restoring an older structure. And I'm convinced that they were restoring an older structure. Just like with the Valley Temple, which is made out of humongous limestone blocks that were carved out when the core body of the Sphinx was carved out, because they had to cut down into the bedrock. That temple is as old as the core body of the Sphinx. I'm convinced of that, the limestone portion, but it was later refurbished with Aswan granite, maybe in dynastic times, maybe even earlier than dynastic times. So something that we have on the Giza Plateau is a very complex situation. We have a very complex situation on the Giza Plateau where we have older structures, but some of those older structures were reappropriated and refurbished at later times. Robert Bauval and I actually wrote a book together called Origins of the Sphinx, and in there we discuss a lot of the evidence for the age of the Sphinx and how it goes back further, and this ties in with Robert Bauval's earlier work on what he calls the Orion correlation theory, that the three pyramids at Giza correlate with the belt stars of Orion, but not in 2500 BCE, but better at 10,000, 10,500 BCE, because at that time, due to precessional changes and other, things do not stay the same in the sky over the millennia. At that time, 10,000 to 10,500 BCE, you get a very, very perfect matching of where the stars are in the sky, that is the star belt, the stars of Orion's belt, relative to the Milky Way, and on the Giza Plateau you have exact correlation of the three pyramids, the three major pyramids, and the Nile representing the Milky Way. So this actually confirms the physical evidence I have for early structures on the Giza Plateau. It doesn't mean that the pyramids we see today go back to 10,000 or 10,500 BCE, but something is being marked there. And this ties again in with my work that we have on the Giza Plateau use and reuse, reappropriation in dynastic times of earlier structures. So as Robert Bauval and I have talked about, and we've printed in our joint book, all this data ties together to point to this earlier aspect of civilization on the Giza Plateau. And I want to point out that that book came out with Robert Bauval, and then a few years later I did a new edition of Forgotten Civilization, my book. So the new edition of Forgotten Civilization, which was published in 2021. It's revised and expanded, includes a lot more photographs, includes an extra chapter where I talk about all this new data and this new material. And I also want to point out that I began talking about the end of the last ice age being caused by a solar outburst in around 2010. I published that in the 2012 edition of Forgotten Civilization, and since then there has been so much work to confirm it. So we now know astrophysically, based on studies just from the last 10 or 12 years, that the sun is much more unstable than we ever suspected, and there are a number of astrophysical studies that demonstrate this now, which I cite in the new edition. Plus, and I want to point this out, some people talk about comets. I am open to comets, but the evidence is better supports a major solar outburst. All the evidence for a comet can be accommodated by the solar outburst, I'll call it hypothesis, and there's other evidence that you cannot explain by a comet. So for instance, Dr. Anthony Peratt, a plasma physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, has done pioneering work on what would you see in the sky during a major solar outburst. You would see configurations. You can think of the northern or southern lights, but taking on very distinct forms. Some of these would look like stick figures with dots on their sides. Some of them would look like birdmen, actually, stick figures with birds' heads, what we can call cascading cylindrical shapes, some toruses taking on shapes in the sky. And what Dr. Peratt initially found is that around the world, and his team has uncovered this and documented this in over 130 countries, from the end of the last ice age, you find that people were inscribing these on rocks, these patterns that they were seeing in the sky, petroglyphs. They were carving petroglyphs on rocks that show exactly what they were seeing in the sky, because it would have been very scary, it would have been very dramatic, and they were recording it. And then when Katie and I, my wife Katie and I, we went to Easter Island, there's incredible birdmen petroglyphs there, but they also have something known as the Rongo script, this so-called hieroglyphic script, which is carved on wooden tablets primarily, the Rongo, which linguists have not really figured out exactly what it represents. How do you translate it? Katie pointed out, looking at the petroglyphs that Dr. Peratt has been studying, the high energy laboratories studies he's done of plasma configurations, that the Rongo characters, the Rongo glyphs, look incredibly similar, in fact identical to many of these petroglyphs. So we're now convinced that the Rongo also records what happens in the sky during a major solar outburst. The tablets themselves, of course, are much more recent physically, but that doesn't mean they aren't copies of what was happening back during those tumultuous times. Just like we have Plato's writings, but not the original writings. We have copies and copies and copies that are 1,000 years or more later than Plato, but we don't doubt that that's what Plato really wrote. So we have all this evidence now for a solar outburst at the end of the last ice age, which to my knowledge, and I've been exploring this for a long time, there's no other single hypothesis, no other single theory that can incorporate all of the evidence. And that, to me, is very important as a scientist, that you have to take all of the evidence into account. What I've tried to live by for over 30 years now is you have to look at all of the evidence, you have to tie it together. I was trained as a geologist, and something I think I gained in my training as a geologist and geophysicist, and also frankly from my childhood growing up with a fairly liberal family and a very well-informed grandmother who was very influential on me, is that you have to bring in all different types of evidence, all different types of fields together and look at the big picture. And that's what I've tried to do. And some people have said by doing that, I've essentially created a new field unto itself that's interdisciplinary, bringing in these diverse lines of evidence. And it's been a struggle. I've had a lot of criticism over the years from my academic colleagues and other people's, but I am confident by the evidence. I'm confident that I'm on the right track, and I'm feeling very good about it. And I feel more confident in my analyses and conclusions now, all these decades later, than I ever have before. And
Thank you
it's a
for-
good feeling.
Thank you for your great work.